May 15, 1945, President Harry Truman sat in the Oval Office reviewing personnel files. In his was a list of names, 17 in total. These were people who had worked closely with Franklin Roosevelt, some for over a decade, senior advisors, cabinet members, White House staff. Truman picked up a pen and wrote one word across the top of the list: out, within 90 days. Every single person on the list would be gone from the White House, fired, reassigned, or pressured to resign. It was the most ruthless purge of a presidential staff in American history, and Truman didn't care who knew it or what they thought about it. The purge started with Henry Wallace. Roosevelt's former vice president and current Secretary of Commerce was the first to go, though Truman waited over a year before pulling the trigger in September 1946. But the planning began immediately. Wallace represented everything Truman distrusted about Roosevelt's inner circle: idealistic to the point of naivety about Soviet intentions, loyal to Roosevelt's memory rather than to the new president, and constantly undermining Truman's authority by invoking what Roosevelt would have done. Wallace had to go. It was just a matter of timing. But Wallace wasn't alone. Within the first 3 months of Truman's presidency, the exodus was stunning. Frances Perkins, Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, the first woman cabinet member in American history, resigned in June. She was essentially forced out. Truman made it clear he wanted his own labor secretary. Henry Morgenthau Jr., Treasury Secretary since 1934 and one of Roosevelt's close friends, was pushed out in July. Truman accepted his resignation with barely concealed satisfaction. Francis Bidd, the Attorney General, was fired outright in June and replaced with Tom Clark, a Truman loyalist. Why the purge? The official explanation was that Truman wanted to build his own team, to have people loyal to him rather than to his predecessor's memory. That was partially true, but the real reasons were darker and more personal. Truman fired everyone close to Roosevelt because he didn't trust them, he resented them, and he believed they had been complicit in Roosevelt's systematic seclusion and humiliation of him. This wasn't just about building a new administration. This was revenge. The depth of Truman's anger became clear in a conversation he had with his military aide Harry Vaughn. In late April 1945, Vaughn later recounted the conversation in his oral history. Truman told him, "These Roosevelt people, they all think him some country bumpkin from Missouri who stumbled into this job by accident. They don't respect me. They don't trust him. And frankly, I don't trust them either. Every damn one of them knew Roosevelt was dying. Every damn one of them knew I was being kept in the dark. And not any of them had the courage or decency to tell me what was happening. So why would he keep them around?" Truman's suspicions about the Roosevelt staff were being their failure to prepare him for the presidency. He believed many of them were actively working to undermine him and preserve Roosevelt's policies regardless of what the new president wanted, and he had evidence. Shortly after taking office, Truman discovered that several Roosevelt holdovers were meeting privately to discuss how to guide the new president, how to prevent them from making what they considered mistakes, how to ensure Roosevelt's vision for post-war America survived intact. These meetings came to Truman's attention through J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director. Hoover, who was concerned about maintaining his own position under the new administration, provided Truman with intelligence reports about the activities of various Roosevelt loyalists. The reports revealed that some White House staff members were sharing information with Eleanor Roosevelt. One was positioning herself as a guardian of his legacy. Others were leaking to friendly journalists to create public pressure on Truman to maintain Roosevelt's policies. Some were even discussing whether there might be constitutional grounds to declare Truman incompetent and remove him from office. When Truman saw these reports, his fury was volcanic. He called in his appointment secretary, Matthew Connolly, and said, "I want a complete list of everyone who was in Roosevelt's inner circle, everyone who had his ear, everyone who met with him regularly. I want to know exactly who these people are, and I want them out. I don't care how long they've been here or how important they think they are." They refinished. The purge wasn't subtle. Truman made clear that loyalty to him and disloyalty to Roosevelt's memory, at least in practice. Staff members who constantly invoked what Roosevelt would have done found themselves reassigned to distant posts or simply fired. People were questioned Truman's decisions by comparing them unfavorably to Roosevelt's approach. Were told bluntly, "President Roosevelt is dead. I'm the president now. If you can't accept that, there's the door. One of the most dramatic firings was Admiral William Leahy, who had been Roosevelt's chief of staff and closest military advisor. Leahy had essentially been running the White House's military operations for years. He was experienced, knowledgeable, and completely devoted to Roosevelt's memory. Truman kept him on initialibicus. He needed Leahy's expertise during the final months of the war with Japan. But as soon as Japan surrendered in August 1945, Truman began marginalizing Leahy, excluding him from key meetings and making decisions with consulting him. By early 1946, Leahy had been effectively removed from power. Though he technically remained on staff until 1949, Leahy wrote bitterly in his diary, "President Truman has made clear that he does not want advice from anyone associated with President Roosevelt. He seems to view us all as obstacles rather than assets. It is a profound mistake, but it is his to make." Leahy's removal sent a message to everyone else. Proximity to Roosevelt was now alienability, not an asset. Truman's purge extended beyond cabinet members and senior staff. He systematically removed a care of civil servants who had been close to Roosevelt. Edward Stettinius Jr., who had been Roosevelt's Secretary of State during the final months, was replaced within months by James Burns, a Truman. Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's most trusted personal advisor, was marginalized immediately and resigned due to illness in July 1945. Sam Roseman, Roosevelt's speechwriter and counsel, resigned in February 1946 after Truman made clear his service were no longer needed. The speed and thoroughness of the purge shocked Washington. This wasn't the normal transition between administrations. This was a hostile takeover of the executive branch by a president who viewed his predecessor's operation as a threat. Newspapers began writing about Truman's purge and Roosevelt exiles. Some criticized Truman for throwing away experience setable out of petty resentment. Others understood that Truman was establishing his authority and couldn't do that with Roosevelt's ghost whispering in every corner of the White House. But there was another reason for the purge that Truman rarely discussed publicly. He had discovered that some Roosevelt staffers had been actively lying to him. In his first weeks as president, Truman had asked various Roosevelt holdovers about decisions that had been made, agreements that had been reached, promises that had been given in multiple cases. He later discovered that what he had been told was misleading or outright false. Roosevelt's staff had been protecting their former boss's reputation by sanitizing the truth, and Truman couldn't trust anything they told him. The most egregious example involved the ALTA agreements. With Stalin, when Truman asked Charles Bolin, a State Department Soviet expert who had been at ALTA, to explain what Roosevelt had agreed to. Bolin gave him a sanitized version that downplayed how much Roosevelt had conceded to Sovietments. Truman later obtained the actual transcripts and notes from Yalta and realized Bolin had been dishonest. Roosevelt had made far more extensive commitments to Soviet control of Eastern Europe than Bolin had admitted. Truman never forgave this deception. Bolin served in government but was never trusted by Truman again. Similarly, when Truman asked about Roosevelt's health and when people had known he was dying, he received evasive answers. No one wanted to admit they had watched Roosevelt deteriorate for months without doing anything to prepare his successor. No one wanted to acknowledge their complicity in keeping Truman ignorant. So they lied, minimized, or simply refused to answer directly. This pattern of dishonesty convinced Truman that he couldn't trust anyone who had been close to Roosevelt. They were loyal to a dead man's reputation, not to the living president or to the truth. The purge had a devastating impact on institutional code. Roosevelt had been president for over 12 years. Many of the people Truman fired had deep expertise in their areas. Knowledge of relationships and agreements and informal understandings weren't written down anywhere. By removing them so quickly, Truman lost access to that institutional memory. Had to learn things the hard way that experienced Roosevelt's staff could have told him immediately. But Truman considered this an acceptable cost. He would rather struggle with inexperienced but loyal staff than rely on experienced staff who undermined him. One particularly bitter episode involved Eleanor Roosevelt herself. While not a government employee, Eleanor had been deeply involved in policy discussions during FDR's presidency. She continued to try to influence policy after his death, offering advice to Truman and advocating for various causes. Initially, Truman was polite and respectful, but as Eleanor continued to invoke her husband's views and imply that Truman was betraying Roosevelt's vision, Truman's patience wore thin. In October 1945, Eleanor sent Truman a long letter criticizing his handling of labor disputes and suggesting he wasn't being true to Roosevelt's commitment to workers' rights. Truman's response was, "Mrs. Roosevelt, I appreciate your perspective. However, I'm the president now, and I must make decisions based on current circumstances, not on what President Roosevelt might have done in a different situation. I hope you can understand and support that." Eleanor got the message. Her direct influence on White House policy ended that day. The most personally painful firing for Truman was probably Frances Perkins. She had been a trailblazer, the first woman in the cabinet serving as Labor Secretary from 1933 to 1945. She was competent, experienced, and genuinely dedicated to workers' rights, but she was also completely devoted to Roosevelt's memory and made no secret of her belief that Truman was inadequate to fill Roosevelt's shoes. In meetings, she would frequently say things like, "President Roosevelt's approach to this was," or, "I think President Roosevelt would want us to." Truman endured this for about 6 weeks before calling Perkins to the Oval Office in early June. He told her directly, "Frances, I appreciate your service to this country, but I need a labor secretary who is focused on my administration histories, not on preserving President Roosevelt's legacy. I think it's time for you to step down." Perkins was devastated but had no choice. She submitted her resignation immediately, years later. She wrote in her memoir that she believed Truman had been insecure and unable to handle being compared to Roosevelt. She was right about the comparison bothering him, but wrong about why Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau's firing was even more dramatic. Morgenthau had been Roosevelt's close friend and trusted economic advisor. He had steered the country through the Depression and financed the war effort. He assumed he would continue as Treasury Secretary under Truman, but Truman had already decided Morgenthau had to go. In July 1945, Morgenthau requested a meeting with Truman to discuss post-war economic policy. Truman used the meeting to tell Morgenthau his services were no longer needed. Morgenthau was shocked and asked why. Truman's response was blunt. "Henry, you were Roosevelt's man. You're not my man. I need people around who are loyal to me, who will implement my policies, not spend their time telling me what Roosevelt would have done. I appreciate your service, but it's time for you to move on." Morgenthau left the meeting stunned. He had expected to serve at least through the end of the war with Japan. Instead, he was out within weeks. The press portrayed it as Truman getting rid of a highly competent economic expert out of spite. Truman didn't care. Attorney General Francis Bidd learned of his firing through a newspaper report before Truman had the courtesy to tell him personally. Truman had decided to replace Bidd with his friend Tom Clark from Texas. Rather than inform Bidd directly, Truman had someone leak it to the press. When Bidd came to Truman's office to confirm the report, Truman simply said, "Yes, it's true. I'm making changes. I'll need your resignation." Bidd asked if there was any specific problem with his performance. Truman's answer was revealing. "No, Francis, you've done fine work, but you were Roosevelt's Attorney General, and I need mine." The pattern was clear. Competence didn't matter. Experience didn't matter. Expertise didn't matter. What mattered was whether someone had been close to Roosevelt. If the answer was yes, they were out. Truman was building an administration based on personal loyalty rather than merit, and he made no apologies for it. He had learned from Roosevelt's treatment of him that in politics, loyalty matters more than capability. So, he demanded absolute loyalty and showed no mercy to anyone while seemed to be living in Roosevelt's shad, out rather than serving Truman's president. By September 1945, just 5 months after Roosevelt's death, Truman had replaced or marginalized everyone in Roosevelt's inner circle. The cabinet was almost entirely new. The White House staff had been turned over completely. Even career civil servants who had been close to Roosevelt found themselves reassigned to obscure posts or pressured to retire. It was a complete transformation of the executive branch, executed with ruthless efficiency. The purge had significant consequence for Truman's presidency. On one hand, it established his authority unambiguously. No one could question who was in charge here, whether Truman was just a caretaker preserving Roosevelt's legacy. Truman was his own man for better or worse. On the other hand, the loss of institutional knowledge and experience hurt the administration. Truman's new team made mistakes that experienced Roosevelt's hands would have avoided. Foreign policy, in particular, suffered from the loss of people. I understood the complex relationships had dealt with Churchill and Stalin. But Truman never regretted that purge. In later years, when asked about why he had fired so many Roosevelt people so quickly, his answer was consistent. I couldn't trust them. They were loyal to a dead man, not to me. They thought I was inadequate and tried to manipulate me. So, I got rid of them. Simple as that. You can't govern if your own staff is working against you. It was a harsh assessment, but not entirely unfair. Many Roosevelt loyalists did view Truman as inadequate and did try to preserve Roosevelt's policies, regardless of what Truman wanted. The most revealing comment about the purge came from Truman's personal diary discovered after his death. In an entry from June 1945, he wrote, "Fired 3 more Roosevelt people today. They look at shocked like they thought they were able to stay forever. Just because Roosevelt had liked them. They don't understand that this is my administration now. Roosevelt left me nothing but problems and people who think I'm not smart enough to solve them. Well, I'm solving them my way and in doing it without people who spend all their time telling me how much better Roosevelt was. If I wanted Roosevelt's policies, I'd have kept Roosevelt's people. I don't, so I won't." That diary entry captures the essence of why Truman fired everyone who worked closely with Roosevelt. It wasn't just about building his own team or establishing authority. It was about anger and resentment that Roosevelt had set him up to fail, and that Roosevelt's people seemed to be rooting for that failure. Truman couldn't succeed as president while surrounded by people who constantly reminded him he was Roosevelt. So, he got rid of them, off them, and rebuilt the White House from scratch with people who believed in Harry Truman. The purge of Roosevelt's staff was Truman's declaration of independence from his predecessor. It was brutal. It was personal, and it was probably necessary. Truman couldn't govern as Roosevelt scared her. He had to govern as his own man, and that meant removing everyone's loyalty was to Roosevelt's memorial. That the Truman's presidency. History has judged the purge harshly in some ways, seeing it as vindictive and wasteful. But from Truman's perspective, it was survival. He had to destroy Roosevelt's infrastructure to build his own, and he did exactly that without hesitation or regret.